Salam. It's really wonderful to be here. Coming all the way from Greece, I could not imagine how developed Azerbaijan was. So coming here and realizing the importance for Haidar Aliyev's work for your country, I was very impressed. So not only scientifically, but also culturally, I will take a lot back to my country. Of course, my sons knew more about Azerbaijan than I did because of the Olympic Games, okay? And because of the rallies that are happening here, okay? The formula. I want to thank the organizing committee for this very honorary presentation. But foremost, I would like to thank Ayten and Ilanova for her incredible work here in the country and for forming a foundation called Birgava Saglam Society. But I also want to thank my very good friend, Binyamin Birkan. Without his work in this country, which has been very substantial, I understand, probably this particular event would not have been potentiated. So thank you all. Is this how do I change the slides? Just press here. Here? Okay. As I was listening to the distinguished presenters this morning, I was thinking, especially Professor Heward, I was thinking that even just telling stories or case studies, as we say in psychology, about kids who have been included in the Greek schools, since 1995, upon my return to Greece from the United States of America, it would have probably been the best way to go for providing ideas about how to go about the process of inclusion. But mine is a little bit more theoretical, and thank you for staying in the room for so long. I hope I'm not too tiring right before lunch. Let me start with what we have inherited by B.F. Skinner, the father of behavior analysis. When he was talking about education, because inclusion is part of our educational processes. So Skinner said that education would be pointless if other consequences were not eventually forthcoming. In other words, how we tie education with real life and how education can be important for a child's life overall. And that will also be the focus of my presentation. What am I doing wrong? Okay. Let's start with the definition of inclusive education and how that applies to the students with disabilities. First of all, I want to point out that there are a lot more commonalities between children with autism and children that are neurotypically developing, as they attend the same classes as their typically developing peers. They participate in the same activities and routine as their typical peers, and they demonstrate progress both academically and socially, as has been widely demonstrated by prior research, and Dr. Neil Martin's presentation demonstrated how indistinguishable kids with autism could be indistinguishable from their teacher's point of view when receiving appropriate, early applied behavior analytic interventions. So children with autism are socially accepted, can be socially accepted by teachers and peers like the rest of their peers. When we talk about inclusive education, one of our greatest challenges is to talk about social integration rather than spatial integration alone. Of course, children with autism have to be in the same space as other kids. They have to be in the same places, but it's more important to focus on whether or not they have friends, they communicate with other children, and school becomes a vehicle for their social advancement rather than simply for their cognitive advancement. Special education started out in the United States in the 1950s, and the first person to question its appropriateness for people with disabilities in general was Lloyd Dunn. So the important question he asked, and we still haven't asked it in Greece, probably it's the same case here in the States, in the late 1960s, was about the appropriateness of services in special education for those students who attended special education, only to find out that for the majority of students, going to special education did not improve their learning abilities. On the contrary, it set them back compared to kids who had been included in regular schools. So based on that, Ziegler and Mensko in 1992 set out the question about environmental variables that may have attributed to that school failure. And I think that if we are serious about inclusive education and special education, we ought to ask those questions in our countries, even with such a large time delay. A few months ago, I was in Zurich attending a very interesting exhibit on Matisse's sculptural work. And toward the end of the exhibit was a very tiny sculpture of a female figure. And as I read through the exhibit, Matisse's point was to be able to create the perfect female figure in one piece of sculpture. The piece of sculpture was tiny, but absolutely beautiful. It had no head and no hands, and yet you could see a beautiful female figure. So when I was looking at that, I said, maybe that's what we ought to do with inclusive practices ourselves. Find those elements from the great complexity of techniques and everything else we have to identify what are some of the most essential elements when we're talking about inclusion. So that's what I tried to do with this presentation. And of course, I think the elegance of our work is depicted primarily in child behavior. So what we need to look at is not simply inclusion, is not simply being in the same space, in the same area as our kids with autism, but what is optimal inclusion? Two of the traditional answers to optimal inclusion have to do with least restrictive environment and most effective education. And you cannot really talk about the one without referring to the other. So the least restrictive environment, just in one slide, refers to the environment that is closest to the environment in which typically developing children are. So for our kids and for inclusive purposes, being in regular class with every other kid is the least restrictive. And you can see being with a regular class with an escort teacher is a little more restrictive, but being in special education would be the most restrictive environment. And of course, down that line were asylums in the past, but supposedly we no longer have asylums. But we're going to focus mostly on most effective education from the perspective of the child and from the perspective of the social milieu as well. Some of the contributing factors to the inclusion movement had to do with being systematic when evaluating educational practices. And as we said before, Lloyd Dunn was the first person to ask that question. So students with special needs did not accomplish their educational goals in special education, and that's when the inclusive education movement started in the United States. The second point to take care of has to do with our prejudices. And what was identified in the US was that there was a disproportionately high representation of students in special education coming from low socioeconomic families and from minorities. So we have to discriminate between whether a kid cannot really go into regular education because they can or because they don't have the resources to go there. So that's another issue we need to look at in our countries, identify whether minority children are overrepresented in special educational classes. And finally, it's important to have an ideology and fight for it. The human rights movement or the normalization movement was the ideology that led to the changes for inclusive education in the United States. So to have effective and appropriate education, we need to consider a host of factors that may contribute to school success. Not inclusion for inclusion, but inclusion as a means for the child with autism spectrum disorder to reach optimal educational and social progress. We have some current concerns that haven't been resolved, even in the United States, and some questions that we need to address. The human rights movement was very helpful in giving voice to people with disabilities and helping us become more aggressive about their rights in regular schools. Yet, people with disabilities do not have the same needs as those of other minorities, and the normalization movement was about every minority, not only kids with disabilities. So kids with disabilities, no matter how good the school setting is, they require special support. Their difficulties may not be attributed to an impoverished environment, as is the case with children from other minorities, such as children that come from culturally or financially impoverished families. And they may also require lifelong services. Another issue of concern has to do with the appropriateness of our teaching procedures and whether or not kids with disabilities require the same types of techniques as kids of typical development. The truth of the matter is, as the literature has demonstrated, kids with disabilities require much more direct teaching than kids that are neurotypically developing. So we have to face the challenge of having groups of children that have different needs. They require different strategies within the same classroom environment, and we have not necessarily resolved that issue. A lot of people claim from the education field that a constructionist approach is much more appropriate for typically developing learners, whereas a direct teaching methodology is more appropriate for children with disabilities. Another issue that I want to raise as a concern that came to me living in Greece and having not that many people to advocate for people with disabilities had to do with whether or not, as a scientist, I would be able to discuss matters with politicians. Soon to find out, because I'm in many committees in my country that have to do with the rights of children with disabilities that tie to the Ministry of Education, that in order to be effective in imposing political change, we have to speak the language of the politicians. We have to say the truth, but in a way that is understood by politicians. Showing single case experimental designs, nice graphs, which I love, doesn't make the difference for a political person. So one of our challenges has to do in translating our very powerful science into political words that can influence politicians in whichever country we work in. So now we will focus on inclusive education specifically for children with autism spectrum disorder. There is a great increase in the number of children with autism enrolled in regular schools. 40 to 70% of children with ASD are now enrolled in general education settings, which is very important to point out. So the majority of our children will be in regular education. Schools in the US have reported an average increase of more than 800% since 1992 in the number of children with autism included in mainstream schools. So the question about how to go about inclusion is very important. And the factors contributing to that increase, of course, are several. Some are related to the child, and some are related to the families. There is an increase in the number of children diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, especially those classified as highly functioning. We know that 69% of people with autism spectrum disorder have an IQ over 75, which means that they have unlimited abilities to progress cognitively. And 85% develop speech, and 47% attain fluent speech. So the way we see kids with autism, the way kids with autism progress today, because of early and intensive behavioral intervention, has changed radically. And of course, there's some family-related issues that have to do with the psychological and social factors that influence parents' decisions to have their child placed in regular education. And parents are better informed than ever before about their rights as they're more organized in child rights organizations. And of course, there are some treatment, education, and policy-related factors. To name a few, 62% of the children with autism spectrum disorder receiving ABA treatment are included in regular school settings, with 25% receiving no support. That's from a meta-analytic study that I published with some of my colleagues 2 years ago. ABA practices can be implemented in school settings. We know that very well. We have plenty, hundreds of studies, evidence-based studies to demonstrate that. Teachers differentiate their instruction to promote learning for all students. So differentiated instruction is now much more acceptable for all learners, not only for kids with disabilities. So that makes it easier for a kid with disability to be included in regular school. And legal mandates require that children with disabilities receive free and appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. So let's start with the most important, probably, question that this presentation addresses. How do we go about reaching optimal outcomes in inclusive education? And I will start this part of my presentation by pointing out that there is an interplay of micro and macro systems that has to do with how effective our practices are. The microsystemic aspects have to do with the individual characteristics of a particular child with autism or the particular family we work with, whereas the macro systems have to do with our policies, the policies of the country in which we live, with school policy, the way schools operate in a particular area, and the ultimate, of course, macro system has to do with economy, and that has changed radically in the past 10, 12 years globally. And so that has made changes in the way we approach children that are also very important. So as scientists, we are trained to look at mostly at the micro picture. What can I do for this individual child, for this individual family? But I'm afraid that we are leaving out some parameters that are also critical, not only across cultures, but also within cultures. If I have done one important thing in my country pertaining to the inclusion of children with autism, was not probably introducing ABA to Greece, but the fact that I was part of a team of scientists that helped pass a law in 2008 that made schooling mandatory for kids with autism. And that changed the whole attitude of the school, of the parents, of everyone. And so it's very critical to assess whether we are addressing with our practices some macro parameters that have to do with inclusive education practices. So the child with autism we see as an ever-changing interactive system that interacts dynamically with his or her therapist, the family, the school, the natural and the social environment by which he or she is surrounded. So to talk about inclusion, we can talk about it in optimal inclusion in two ways. One way has to do with comprehensive treatment that entails various agents, of course, child-related, but also agents that have to do with school, the parents, the overall community. So this is one way to talk about comprehensive treatment. And another way to talk about comprehensive treatment is pertaining to the child as a sole agent. In this particular case, and this is how we have been talking about as behavior analysts mostly, it has to do with how can we help a child with autism reach optimal inclusion. And we know already that highly structured therapeutic interventions are critical, as well as naturalistic intervention provided by parents, that social skills training with groups of peers are critical before we start inclusion, and finally, providing the right support in inclusive educational settings is also a critical factor, and I'm going to focus mostly on this particular element that has to do with the inclusion of kids with autism. So my suggestion is that in order to provide a comprehensive treatment in the sense of child-related variables, we need to start with assessing children with autism spectrum disorder strengths and weaknesses thoroughly, not using a standardized test, but observe their behavior, use direct observation in the school environment, and assess in what areas these children are lagging behind. After we identify the areas in which they have difficulty, how do we set our criteria for improvement? So that is the second step to start collecting normative data. Look at what the rest of their typically developing peers are doing in school. And finally, use behavior analytic technology to teach and to treat. But this is the third step, and of course, to teach in a way that fosters generalization, maintenance, and self-management. We conducted a series of 3 studies to demonstrate how we go about doing that in an empirical way, using experimental design methodologies. The first study had to do with assessing and setting goals for the attending and communicative behavior of 3 preschoolers with autism in inclusive kindergarten in Greece. In that particular study, we collected data in various ways, using always direct observational recording procedures. No matter how many standardized instruments we have used to diagnose a child, it's very important to see in the here and now, in that particular child, what are his and her strengths and weaknesses. So we used various methodologies in order to assess the children's needs, and our findings were several. We identified 4 areas in which children with autism all children with autism that we assessed had great difficulties, and that was making social initiations, approaching their peers and talking to them, responding to their peers' invitations, following group commands. So if the teacher addressed that child personally, the child would respond. But if it was a group instruction, everybody, let's go to recess, they would not respond. And also responding to group questions. Who's going to tell me in this picture who this is, right? who's going to tell me? They could not understand as a command. They had to be addressed personally by the teacher to reply, okay? And the hard part of the study, the hard part as far as the outcome comes, the surprise was that typically developing kids in kindergarten had already developed tremendous social responses. So by the age of 4, they already engage in complex social behavior. We identified over 120 categories and subcategories of social initiations that 4-year-old, typically developing kids were making. And this data was amazing. It made me cry because I felt I have so much work to do. And they responded to peer initiations almost all the time, 80%. They responded to group commands almost all the time, over 90%, and to group questions about 60% of the time. Okay, so as a behavior analyst, I didn't give up. I went along to start my new study that had to do, how do we change that picture? How do we help our kids with autism improve themselves in those exact areas in which they had demonstrated difficulties? And of course, we use prompting and social reinforcement procedures alone to foster the development of social interactions in which our kids lagged behind. And these are the data. It was a multiple baseline design across 4 different children. And all of our children started out with making no or minimal initiations to peers. And right after treatment, they were able to develop initiations. And they were also able to generalize those initiations to new therapists, at least for the last 2 children who stayed long enough in the study, because the other 2 dropped out of the study. The picture was very similar for making reply statements to their peers' initiations, okay? They increased immediately with the introduction of treatment. So our findings were that kids with autism immediately reached criterion, which, as I said before, was the level of functioning of their typically developing peers. They reached criterion immediately in following group demands, in responding to group questions, and that generalized to their school teacher, and that behavior maintained 3 months without intervention. The area in which they required substantial more training, as anticipated, was the area of social initiations and of responding to peer invitations. The most concerning outcome of this result was that there was low maintenance of their appropriate behavior, which took us months to teach. It was a very expensive intervention. That in the absence of the shadow teacher, the social initiations and responses to peers did not maintain. So again, we didn't give up. But we started setting up our new study to see how we can foster maintenance of those socially appropriate responses that kids acquired through treatment. And that study is now under review. We had 3 participants with autism spectrum disorder participating in that study, and we targeted initiations to our peers and reply statements. And again, the intervention included prompting, social reinforcement, but also a self-management set of techniques, including self-monitoring, self-evaluation, and self-recruitment of reinforcement, which was the interesting part of this research. We were very happy with the outcome. All 3 participants in this study, again, were able to make gains in social behavior right after the introduction of treatment. But the surprising part was that the self-management procedures did not only reduce that behavior, but they further increased their social behavior, which was a very powerful effect that, as I said before, we didn't anticipate. Same was the case for responding to peers' initiations. So children with autism spectrum disorders reached same levels of responding as typical peers in both the areas of social initiation and in responding to peer initiations, which were two critical areas for our kids. And self-management procedures led to even greater improvement than was reached with the shadow teacher being present. Generalization to the school teacher was reached, and most importantly, maintenance 3 months without intervention was also achieved with this particular study. So, concluding with the series of studies we conducted with our kids, I have to say that children with autism may improve immediately and even reach age-appropriate criterion in several areas, following group commands, responding to group questions, making social initiations, responding to peer initiations, and treatment gains generalized and maintained across time. Yet, several questions for me remain. Okay, we know what to do when the child is the sole agent we work with. But how can we make our intervention more effective and more efficient with the child having to do less work are the types of questions I'm currently asking in my research. In other words, what can we do in order to engage the parents, their siblings, their peers, their teachers, their school administration, society, and the state in the inclusion process? So we go back to that particular figure in which comprehensive treatment now doesn't have to do only with the child, but incorporates several other agents, as I said before, the child's family, the child's school, the child's community, the child's country in which the country in which the child lives. And to answer that question, I was very fortunate 3 years ago to receive a huge grant by the Onassis Foundation to start answering more systemic questions about autism. And the first program that we run is a program for systematic desensitization of children with autism spectrum disorder and for training families and therapists, airport personnel, and passengers on how to accept kids with autism at the airport and during flights. I was trying to avoid that project, but I have a lot of fun doing actually this project. So what Boarding Pass to Autism has achieved as a program is an air travel simulation training program targeting four populations. Not only children and adolescents with autism spectrum disorder, which they went through a comprehensive desensitization program for airplane flights, but also we trained their parents and the therapists, mostly special educators, using personalized social stories and behavioral techniques to help children overcome their fears for flying. We also trained staff of the Athens International Airport, Eleftherios Venizelos, and wired airport stakeholders and community. And we are trying to educate passengers through leaflets and information which are available at the web and also as they travel at the airport. Now, not only does the airport adapted these particular practices for the past 3 years, but other airports in Greece are asking to do the same program. The Greek police and the police of the municipality of Athens are asking to have the same program. We're actually in the second year of collaborating with them, and it's a lot of fun. Let me tell you that I never anticipated that working with policemen would be so much fun. They're so disciplined. They're born to accept behavior analytic principles very much faster than teachers in Greece anyway, okay? They're a lot of fun to work with. And now, for the first year, we started out with hospital staff, and these are now people who are asking for those services, to understand the needs of people with autism spectrum disorder and plan hospital visits accordingly. So we have a desensitization program for kids to go for checkups in hospitals, and the hospital personnel to be educated on how to address the kids' needs. Part of those data have been analyzed, and I will just show you some data that are very exciting. Out of a sample of 134 people, by the end of the year, we will have over 350 people. 83% found that the educational program changed their attitude toward peers, toward people with autism spectrum disorder. And the fact that they keep on asking for the same program for their new employees is very reinforcing for us. It probably demonstrates the social value of this particular project. And I'm also going to share that the training we do has to do with their professional role. So one of the questions we ask is whether this particular program is useful for their job. And 93% of the participants say, yes, this is very useful for our job. All the information pertaining to this study are on the web. The Onassis Foundation has managed to make the translations of all the materials we have in English as well. So all the materials we have used for the desensitization process and the leaflets we give out to passengers are all in English as well. Okay, just to get you a sense of what the airport staff said about our training program.
Οι γνώσεις μου γύρω από το συγκεκριμένο θέμα ήταν πολύ περιορισμένες, καταρχήν. Διότι γνώριζα όσα γνωρίζει ο μέσος άνθρωπος. Σήμερα με το σεμινάριο που κάναμε, μπορώ να πω ότι αναγνώρισα και συμπεριφορές, οι οποίες πριν μπορεί να ήταν από αστείες μέχρι εκνευριστικές και σήμερα έχουν νόημα.
Αυτή η εμπειρία του σεμιναρίου ήταν πολύ χρήσιμη για τη δουλειά μας, γιατί εμείς έχουμε να κάνουμε με πολύ κόσμο. Οπότε, αναγνωρίζοντας τα σημάδια των ανθρώπων με αυτισμό, μπορούμε να βοηθήσουμε και να βοηθηθούμε κι εμείς.
Θεωρώ ότι μετά το σεμινάριο βλέπω το χώρο του αεροδρομίου τον ίδιο, με διαφορετικά μάτια. Από την άποψη ότι ξέρω καλύτερα πώς να αντιμετωπίσω κάποιους ανθρώπους οι οποίοι είναι ιδιαίτεροι και χαρισματικοί.
Η αλήθεια είναι ότι μέχρι τώρα δεν είχα συνειδητοποιήσει ούτε γνώριζα το πόσο δύσκολο είναι ο χώρος του αεροδρομίου για έναν άνθρωπο με αυτισμό.
Τα ερεθίσματα είναι έντονα και είναι διαφορετικά. Ηχητικά ερεθίσματα, οπτικά ερεθίσματα, εναλλαγή χρωμάτων, εναλλαγή θορύβων. Φανταστείτε και για ανθρώπους οι οποίοι μπορεί να μην έχουν αυτισμό ή συμπτώματα αυτισμού, μπορεί να είναι έντονα, δηλαδή και για εμάς τους ίδιους. Πόσο μάλλον για μια ομάδα ανθρώπων πιο ευαίσθητοι που το προσεγγίζουν αυτό τελείως διαφορετικά και πρέπει εμείς αυτό να κοιτάξουμε πώς να το κάνουμε πιο εύκολο, πιο άνετο για εκείνους.
Ο χειρισμός ενός επιβάτη με αυτισμό απαιτεί να ακούσουμε την ανάγκη του ίδιου του επιβάτη, ούτως ώστε να μπορέσουμε και εμείς να τον βοηθήσουμε με τον καλύτερο δυνατό τρόπο.
Επειδή τα παιδιά αυτά δεν κινούνται μόνο στον δικό μου χώρο, αλλά κινούνται γενικά και οφείλουν να κινούνται παντού ως ίσοι πολίτες μεταξύ ίσων, θα πρέπει να υπάρχει πληροφόρηση στον κόσμο.
Είναι θέμα παιδείας και πολιτισμού το να μάθουμε τον τρόπο να συνυπάρχουμε με τους ανθρώπους με ιδιαιτερότητες.
What prompted these particular interventions on my part was an understanding that sometimes our kids work too hard to achieve an outcome, whereas if we work more systematically with the systems surrounding our kids, we can make our work more effective and more efficient. I studied for 9 years after my doctoral work on how to approach families of kids with autism. First, I started out with the 2-year psychoeducational programs because there was no literature on how to work effectively with families and providing them with the support they need. And then another 7 years on general systems theory, only to begin to realize after those 9 years that it was equally challenging to comprehend the family and their world as a very powerful system for the child. Those principles helped me realize that general systems theory was a complementary paradigm to behavioral analysis. The behavior analytic perspective helps us understand at a micro level the needs of the child and the family more so than ever before. But general systems theory, that perspective helped me anyway understand things at a macro level that for a small country like Greece is critical and important. So the emphasis of the two approaches, I call it complementary because one is emphasizing the complexity of human behavior, behavior analysis, and the need for rigorous therapeutic interventions, whereas general system theory perspective helped me realize the systemic complexity and emergence. Very quickly, complexity is a key idea in general systems theory, helping us realize that it's important to move from a linear understanding of causal relationships to a multi-level, multi-system interpretation of people and the relations they form, searching for the multiple factors that may contribute to change and that are not always related only to the child. An appreciation of the needs of a child with autism spectrum disorder in school may be achieved through a search for his or her connections, links, interconnections with systems and subsystems within the school setting. Living systems interact dynamically. So the child with autism, being mandatory that he or she is in regular school since 2008 in Greece, has changed the way the teacher interprets his or her classroom. And at the same time, it has changed the child with autism's perspective of the world. The idea of emergence is an important characteristic of complexity, which explains how the whole emerges from this part and helps us understand that when two living systems interact, the outcome is not additive, but may have qualities that don't exist in the parts. So the idea of emergence that arises from chaotic theories, it started out from physics, like the basic principles of behavior analysis as well, is the lack of predictability of several, because we could have several possible outcomes. So the idea is not that we give up because the world functions chaotically, but to identify the conditions under which emergence occurs, and according to general system theory, change occurs under conditions that are far from stability, but also far from disequilibrium. So if we apply that principle in the Greek matters, the disequilibrium that was created by making the inclusion of children with autism mandatory potentiated change. And the main questions we need to answer is, now that the environment has changed so radically, how can we make those changes meaningful for the child with autism and for the school as well? The answer that comes from behavioral analytic practices we saw earlier, having a least restrictive and most effective environment, and what the general system theory has to add to that is the most important quality for living systems, which has to do with the ability to self-organize. So I think we ought to look very carefully now that we know what makes optimal inclusion possible. The questions that continue to remain has to do with how we can help the child with autism and the family of the child with autism self-organize through the process of treatment. And finally, my over 20 years of work in Greece has helped me realize that inclusion, or working with kids with autism in general, poses several dilemmas. And some of the most important dilemmas have to do with some sensitive balances that we need to keep, which holds true for our own lives as well. How much time are we going, of the kids' time, are we going to spend on education, work, occupation later on in life? And how much time are we going to spend for their recreation, for their happiness? How much time are we going to spend on one-to-one special treatment education? And how much time are we going to spend on inclusion, participation, and acceptance? How much emphasis is going to be paid on achievement and reputation versus satisfaction or gratification? Thank you for your attention, and I just want to share the most important moment of the first child that was ever included in Greece in regular school in 1996. It was a very difficult inclusion. But what kept me going at that point was Stephanie's words. Geli, now kids smile at me at school. So that's what keeps me going despite the many difficulties we are encountering through the inclusion process. Thank you for your attention.
Bizim bir neçə sualımız var. Angeliki Hanım'a, we have few questions for you. Yes. Birinci sualımız Rus dilindədir. Что лучше для особенного ребенка? Получение образования в специализированной школе, инклюзии или же в обычной школе?
Well, it depends on the country, it depends on the concept. If I were in the UK or in the USA, where there are fantastic special schools for kids with autism, I would probably say choose a fantastic special school. Living in Greece, I'm totally against any special education schools because there are places that where no education is happening. As one of the teachers of one of the kids I work with told their parents, he said, not only did we accept your son to our school, do you want him to learn how to read and write? So the idea, obviously, in some countries is that you just drop kids to special schools and you don't have to do anything with them. I don't know the realities of your own country as far as special education services, but as I said during the presentation, inclusion is not for inclusion. Inclusion is one of the means we need to use in order to provide most appropriate, most effective education. So the question is, where is the child in the long run going to benefit the most? And make sure that any school you select for your child, regular school or special school, they assess progress. That's the critical variable. How do they assess progress?
Next question is, how to prepare autistic kids to go to the airport because they are so confused?
Well, the program we used is what is traditionally called, we can either call it a shaping procedure or a systematic desensitization procedure. It's the same thing, obviously. We help the child with specific steps, step by step, to be able to go to the airport one step at a time with maintaining a relaxed composition. All the materials for these programs and all the steps we used, even the picture programs that we used, are on the internet at the Onassis Foundation site, the site that I used a little before.
Another question is in English too. So, is it depends on the level of autism of child to study in mainstream school or special one?
Again, it doesn't have to do with the level of the child or the level of the school. It has to do with where does a child with autism reach reaches a better level socially, cognitive, and in every other respect. So it's not so important whether it's a special school or a regular school. What is important is that the child makes the best out of their placement, okay? So where is the child going to reach optimal outcome is what we're concerned about. And being in regular school, if a child does not make any progress, is not appropriate. Being in a special school, if the child doesn't make progress, again, is not an appropriate place for them. So it's a functional answer. The best place is where is best for the child, where the child makes the best progress. Okay?
İnklüziv təhsil zamanı siniflərdə çox hallarda sağlam uşaqların valideynlərinin əks reaksiyası ilə qarşılaşırıq. Bu problemi sizin fikrinizcə necə həll etmək olar?
The reactions of the typically developing children's parents before 2008 were simply, kids with autism do not belong in the same school as my kid. Since the law changed, they had no choice. And yes, legal issues are important in this particular case because then they had to face the reality that kids with disability would be in regular schools because schooling became mandatory for all children despite the level of their disability. So they're learning to put up with it, but the attitude of most parents is racistic, to say the least. So we have a lot of work to do in Greece to change people's attitudes.
Və sonuncu sualımız, or last question, is also in Azərbaycani. 2 yaş 8 aylıq uşaq danışmır, komandalara cavab vermir, adını çəkəndə baxmır, pasiv və sakitdir. Amma digər uşaqlarla oynayanda hər şey yaxşıdır, yaxınları ilə gülür, oynayır, musiqiləri tanıyır. Bu nitq ləngiməsidir, yoxsa autizm əlamətidir?
Even children with autism who can talk still do not make social initiations. You were asking before, what is the difference between a kid with autism and a kid with speech delay? If you work with a kid with a speech delay and you improve their language, you put them to school, they use all the language they have. If the kid is with autism and they are beginning to speak and you put them in a class, they will not use what they have learned. So the social aspect of language is inherently difficult for kids with autism. So not only do we have to teach language, we also have to teach communication and the social functions of language, meaning I can use language to communicate with others. You have to teach both. By teaching language alone, you don't improve social language.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Teşekkür ederiz.